Thanks for coming, everyone. I'm a conservationist. I spent most of my life, um, most of my career first working as a conservation practitioner and then as a conservation scientist. Mainly, I've worked a bit in the UK, but I've largely worked in tropical contexts. I've worked in Mauritius on some of the world's rarest species, and then I spent 10 years in Madagascar working with WWF and others to help establish new protected areas in forests and in coastal lagoons with fisher people, small scale fishers that depend on the resources that you're trying to conserve. And throughout this time, I've really felt an urgent need to conserve biodiversity, and I've felt the importance of the field of biodiversity conservation to save these last few scraps of biodiversity that we have, to save these species on the edge from going extinct, and to stop us losing the last wild forests and corners of the ocean. But I've always felt that it was really obvious, actually, that all our conservation efforts were not enough. As critical as they are, they're not enough. And I spent a lot of time thinking about why they're not enough recently, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. So conservation works since the field of conservation science came together in the 80s. We've compiled this really amazing evidence base for what works and what doesn't work in conservation, and our conservation strategies work. We have saved dozens of species from extinction, species that otherwise would have been extinct. This is the Mauritius kestrel. It was down to 4 individuals, but the project to conserve it was so successful that it was downgraded twice on the IUCN Red List. It was downgraded from critically endangered to endangered, and then again down to vulnerable. So we know how to save even the most threatened species from extinction. We know how to stop deforestation, stop the transformation of ecosystems with protected areas, with parks and reserves. This is a satellite image of a park in New Zealand, and it's clear to see the limits of that protected area have had an impact on ecosystem change. We know how to catch fish and harvest other resources sustainably. We know how to eradicate invasive species from the most delicate island ecosystems, where they're driving a sort of flightless species and other endemics to extinction. We know how to restore ecosystems, and in this and every other aspect of what we do as conservationists, importantly, we've learned how to do all these things not just as technical processes, but as social processes. Like, we recognize that the work we do it within social ecological systems where other people are part of the system, and we've taken on board the techniques and the theories of the social sciences to embed our work, to inform what we do. So we know how to do all these things, but nevertheless we are losing biodiversity. We're losing biodiversity at staggering rates, and we're not slowing it at all. On the left, this is the decline in monitored populations of vertebrates in WWF's Living Planet Index, and on the right is an index of biodiversity intactness. In both of these, they're divided by continent, by region, and in both cases we see huge declines over the centuries and decades. We are not reversing these declines in biodiversity despite all our skills in preventing biodiversity loss. So what's going on? How can it be that we know what to do, but we're losing? Why? Why is this the case? Well, I think there are 3 theories of change, three different ways that I think that the conservation sector presumes we will have an impact that don't necessarily stand up to closer scrutiny. So I'd like to, I think we need to acknowledge and consider these faulty theories of change. The first is that if we generate information as scientists, if we generate information about biodiversity loss and the consequences of biodiversity loss, and we make that information available to our leaders, then our leaders will use that information to make wise decisions in the public good. Which I think this underpins much of science, much of why we do research, why we try to generate knowledge, is to make society a better place, to make things better. But it rests upon this assumption that actually information is what we need to make things better. And of course, information is vital, but it's not sufficient. And it's not sufficient because as researchers, we tend to think that, if we make the information available to decision makers, if we tell them how important it is to stop climate change, how critical it is to reverse biodiversity loss, that somehow we're the only people in the room with them. We're the only sources of information that they're absorbing and factoring into their decision making. And of course, this is horrendously naive, because not only are we not the only people with a say in these decisions, but others are trying to influence decision makers in completely different ways and using completely different tools. So this is a table showing the amount spent by sector on political lobbying in the USA in 2022. $125 million by oil and gas, $80 million by the car industry, $100 million from energy and natural resources, $40 million from agribusiness. So these are, these are other people that are also trying to influence the policy decisions made by political decision makers. But rather than, while we are going to those decision makers with graphs and data and making a good case for the importance of preventing biodiversity loss, these other stakeholders, if you like, are going to those same political decision makers with vast buckets of cash. And this is one country in 1 year, and this is only the half of it. So this is money spent on political lobbying. This doesn't include direct donations, and certainly for oil and gas, the direct donations are comparable to the money spent on lobbying. So this is literally only half of it. So it's really naive to think that, that our graphs are the appropriate way to try and address political decision making. If this is, the battlefield on which we're trying to generate evidence-based policy. So this and all this money representing private interest in politics, it leads to what George Monbiot calls the polluter paradox, which basically says that the dirtier your industry, the more you have to spend on political influence to avoid getting regulated out of existence. Therefore, government ends up being most funded by the very dirtiest industries and ends up governing by, for the benefit of the dirtiest industries. And we see this, all the time when it comes to environmental policy. This top headline from the Guardian in 2022 is particularly obvious. The headlines aren't always that obvious, but UK overrules scientific advice by lifting ban on bee harming pesticide. This just it shows the limits of this way of thinking, that we just have to present the evidence. Well, yes, scientists did present the evidence. They said the evidence was very, very clear. These particular pesticides had to be banned. It was in the public interest. They had to be banned. And yet the scientists were overruled because of lobbying from industry. We see it with even when we do make political advances. But during COP26, there were reasonably impressive efforts to make headway on deforestation policy, global deforestation pledges. But agribusiness giants tried to thwart them. We've seen it recently very directly with the Tory backtracking on pollution rules, because their biggest funder is the house building industry. Sometimes scientists get all the way into the heart of government. Scientists don't have to try and influence government. They're in government. They are government advisors. Even then, it doesn't mean you'll lead to changes in policy. This from 6 months ago. Ministers ignored their own advisors on biodiversity targets. So clearly there's only so far that science is going to get us. And we see the same even more starkly perhaps with climate change. So it's the science is abundantly clear. We couldn't possibly have a more compelling evidence base for the need to rapidly decarbonize in every sector as quickly as we possibly can. And yet in the UK government, our current government are expanding fossil fuel production with oil and gas licenses in the North Sea. They are opening new coal mines. In the last, they've announced £27 billion for a massive road building spree a few years ago, expanding airports. We're still building new houses to such incredibly low energy efficiency standards, and with gas boilers, that brand new houses with gas boilers, they're going to need those boilers are going to need to be ripped out to meet our decarbonisation targets. You can apply for a grant to rip out your new gas boiler as soon as you buy your new house. So it couldn't be clearer that this naive old idea that a scientist's job is to provide the information and that information will lead to good policy decisions. It's not the case. That doesn't work. This planetary emergency we're suffering is not an information deficit problem. We are not hurtling into this emergency blindfolded. We know what we're doing. Also, rather, our decision makers know what they're doing. So if we want evidence-based decisions as scientists, as the scientific community, if we want policies that are informed by the evidence, then we need to acknowledge that evidence alone is not sufficient, because this is about power and influence. And simply having the knowledge will never be enough to generate the transformative change we need at the speed we need it, because it ignores the processes that most powerfully influence political and policy change. And it doesn't address the forces that are so heavily invested in maintaining the status quo. We can't think that simply generating red lists and ever more stark warnings about the loss of biodiversity will ever be sufficient if we don't think about the powers and the interests that profit so well from the continued destruction of biodiversity. And the influence that they have on policy. Now, of course, we can't hope to compete with them in terms of financial influence. We can't hope to be spending hundreds of millions of pounds on lobbying of government ministers. Yeah, that's not a game we can play, but we can try to understand that this is about power, and we can counter that power with a power of our own, and that's people power. So our second theory of change as conservationists is that if we generate solutions, then society will pay for us to implement those solutions. We'll work out how to conserve biodiversity, and society will say, yes, we want to conserve biodiversity, and we will make this a funding priority for our society, and we will make sure that biodiversity is conserved. Unfortunately, that just isn't the case. It's not happening. So our principal conservation strategy is managing parks and reserves. You saw in that second slide, there's that aerial photo of a big circle around the mountain in New Zealand. Parks and reserves, they work, or they can work, but for them to work, they rely on funding. It's not enough to draw a line on a map and a sign saying, okay, this is a protected area now. They need to be actively managed. 15% of the Earth's land surface is in protected areas. I think this is a phenomenal achievement. 15% of all land is in parks and reserves, and that's incredible. But they need money to fund them. And this 15% of the Earth currently gets about $24 billion in funding. So that's annual spending on all the green bits on the map there. And the blue bits is another 10% of the oceans, or something, so 8%, I'm not sure. It sounds like a lot of money, this 24 billion. It's about the size of the global market in beard grooming products. It's less than a third of global spending on ice cream. And that is how important society has decided that conserving biodiversity is. Can you imagine? Less than a third as important as ice cream. So why? Everybody knows about wildlife. Everybody says they love wildlife. Everybody in our societies. Why are we not funding conservation? Well, I think it's because we haven't communicated the importance and the urgency of it at all. And partly this is, I think, partly about it's about our message for so long, and to this day we talked about it as the altruistic quest to conserve other species. This is, we're doing this for the pandas and for the tigers and for the koalas, and this is for other species. And of course, we all love other species, but the fact that society has decided that whilst it might profess to like them, it's not going to actually pay for them. So James Bullock and I argued actually that maybe we need to move beyond this framing a bit, and talk about the real importance of biodiversity, which is that it's not about other species at all. It's about us, and particularly in a climate emergency context. Conserving biodiversity is nothing less than conserving ourselves. It's maintaining the planetary conditions to allow us to survive. We cannot survive without biodiversity, as simple as that. So I think we need to change how we talk about it to some extent, and really impress, how important it is. But it's also simply the case that across our society, and particularly in the media, we don't talk about biodiversity and its importance at all. So this slightly out of date chart compares total media coverage of biodiversity, which is the green bar along the bottom, with media coverage of climate change, which is the brown bars. And you can see, climate coverage spikes every so often when there's a big COP meeting. But coverage of biodiversity issues is uniformly very, very low, and has been for the last 3 decades. And this is, comparing climate change comparing biodiversity loss to climate change. And of course, we all know that climate change doesn't get any coverage itself either. So, climate change was mentioned 10 times less than cake on UK TV in 2022. So, imagine what this chart would look like if you were comparing coverage of biodiversity to, I don't know, to football or something. We simply do not talk about the importance of biodiversity and conservation in the media at all. So people do not understand that this is important. This is, nothing is more fundamental than functioning ecosystems. Without functioning ecosystems, there is nothing. And yet, society just continues on blindly, seemingly, completely ignoring this very, very simple fact. So, our third theory of change is that and this is a bit of a woolly one, and I need to think about this more carefully. But as a sector, of course, we are preoccupied with the most threatened things. We focus on the impacts of our unsustainable human activities, deforestation, small population sizes of threatened species. And that's, of course, that's important, that's vital. But it sort of ignores the fact that if you're only focusing on the impacts, then you're not addressing the drivers. If you're only focusing on curing the disease, you're not focusing on preventing it. And we sort of assume that, I don't know, other people will take care of that. We're conservationists, that other environmentalists, environmental activists will take care of that or something. But that again is not sufficient. And while of course the work of conservation is hugely important to save the last wild places and to stop the most threatened species going extinct, it doesn't address the root of the problem. Now, the recent IPBES, or I say recent, it was 2019 now, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services reports that came out a few years ago talked about how avoiding catastrophic biodiversity loss requires transformative change, namely a fundamental system-wide recognition across technological, economic, and social factors, making sustainability the norm rather than the altruistic exception. So we need transformative change in everything about our societies, and simply focusing on conservation of biodiversity doesn't actually address that. But if we don't address it, all we're doing is just merely delaying biodiversity loss. We can stop a species sliding from endangered into the dark waters of critically endangered now, but you know, if we don't stop the drivers of loss, they'll be critically endangered in a few years. We can stop somewhere, yeah, a forest being chopped down now, but it'll be chopped down in the future if things don't fundamentally change. So we need to do more. It's not that what we do isn't important, but it's not sufficient because it doesn't address the underlying drivers. So how do we as a sector, whether we're conservation practitioners, whether we're conservation scientists, or whether we're just nature lovers, how do we overcome these weaknesses in our theories of change? How do we become more influential? How do we communicate with more urgency? And how do we catalyze the transformative change in our societies and economies that we know has to come sooner or later? Whether we do that in a planned, preemptive way, or whether it's imposed upon us by by collapse, essentially, when our ecosystems and climate can take no more. Well, the answer seems to be, and social scientists seem to be converging on this same answer, really, is we join social movements and we to help build momentum towards social tipping points. Now, there's different definitions of social tipping points and social tipping processes, but they're points at which basically rapid you get past the tipping point and rapid change becomes inevitable and can happen very, very quickly. And we don't know, these tipping points differ in different sectors, and we don't know where they are. We do know that they come about through numbers of people. And there comes a point where the number of people working for change and demanding change and making change happen becomes such that change becomes inevitable. And so there's lots of research about these social tipping points and social tipping processes and social tipping interventions over the last few years. And there was this exchange in proceedings of National Academy of Sciences. There was the first paper by Ilona Otto and colleagues said, achieving a rapid global decarbonization. So sorry, this discussion was in regards to climate change, not biodiversity loss, but it's the same transformative change that is needed for both. The changes needed to address for rapid decarbonization will also they're the same sorts of changes that are needed to reverse biodiversity loss. They said achieving a rapid global decarbonization to stabilize the climate critically depends on activating contagious and fast-spreading processes of social and technological change within the next few years. So they said, it can be done, but we need these social tipping points. And there was this response that said, of all the proposed social tipping interventions require radical government action, right? Either at national or local level. But so in labeling their interventions as starting points in the transformation process, they actually fail to ask, well, who initiates these deliberate process of radical change in the collective interest? What starts these processes? Does it tend to be government, the private sector, or civil society? Well, the evidence points to civil society and social movements as initiators of rapid social transformations. And when we look at the evidence of history, it's social movements, and particularly social movements employing the tool of non-violent civil disobedience or non-violent civil resistance, that have been at the forefront of many of the major progressive social changes that we've enjoyed, or at least partially enjoyed, in our societies over the last century or more. So the suffragettes won votes for women. There was the struggle for civil rights in the USA for civil rights for people of color. In the 80s, there was the struggle for gay rights that won civil rights for the LGBTQ plus people, and that was necessary to catalyze policy action on the AIDS crisis. Again, despite mounting, growing evidence, scientific evidence about the need for policy action on the AIDS crisis, it didn't happen until the gay rights movement rose up and demanded it. So these non-violent people's movements have resorted to civil resistance to enhance their struggles, and they have gained the policy changes that they demanded as a result, often over extraordinary lengths of time, but they have won using these tactics, and these tactics work in a number of ways. Like they directly put pressure on decision makers because they disrupt the smooth functioning of society, and they're expensive to police, and they're difficult to govern, and that puts pressure on you to resolve the situation. Perhaps a more powerful mechanism is that they shine a spotlight on an issue that wasn't being talked about. Well, at least it wasn't being talked about in the media, and it wasn't being talked about by most people. It wasn't part of the national conversation. People, the media weren't particularly talking about segregation in the Deep South until certain high-profile acts of resistance, such as Rosa Parks and her refusal to get off her bus seat, forced the issue into the national conversation. And then once it's part of the national conversation, people see the injustice of it. They see that there is a need for change, and they start to demand that change themselves. And then the act of disobedience itself, it's a particularly powerful communication tool, I feel. It helps communicate the importance and urgency of the issue. It's difficult to see people engaging in acts like these, particularly illegal acts that carry a risk of arrest, without asking yourselves questions as to why they would be prepared to make such a sacrifice. And so the act of sacrifice is often an integral part of these acts of resistance, because it communicates just how important the issue must be. And civil disobedience has a long and proud history as part of the environmental movement. We don't ever really talk about it in conservation circles at all, and yet when we think back to some of the great conservation wins of the early days of the environmental movement, what were the big wins for biodiversity in the 70s and 80s? Well, the Save the Whales, the International Whaling Commission, the IWC's moratorium on industrial whaling in 1982 was one of the biggest conservation victories there was. And this wasn't a victory that was earned by traditional conservationists. It wasn't earned by having protected areas and lines on a map. It wasn't earned by papers. papers monitoring the declines of whale populations, or modeling the impact of reduced whale populations on, I don't know, on fisheries or anything. It wasn't research that won this. It was direct action by Greenpeace going out into the oceans, risking the safety of individuals and shining a spotlight on these abhorrent practices. And that stimulated massive public concern back in the UK. This picture on the bottom right is outside the IWC meeting in London in 1982, where that moratorium came into being. So yeah, this has a history in conservation, and yet it's not something that conservationists seem to believe is in our toolkit. Whereas I firmly believe that it might just be one of the sharpest tools we have. So today, obviously, you know, people's movements, social movements are on the rise again. This tactic has been growing again in the last 4 or 5 years, and this time it's the environment that is, you know, the cause for concern. Most famously, in the UK, it's been led by Extinction Rebellion and the Greta Thunberg inspired youth strikes, but there are, you know, environmental social movements, yeah, springing up all over the world. Largely, these have focused on climate change rather than the accompanying biodiversity crisis. But they have been hugely successful in changing the conversation on climate change since Extinction Rebellion formed in 2018 and had its first really massive protests in London in 2019. They have changed the public, media, and political conversation on climate change. So polling shows that public concern over the environment and climate change tends to rise directly after big XR actions. They in the first year after XR launched, we had unprecedented media coverage. There was a climate debate before the last general election, and it had an influence on policy. So weeks after XR protests in April 2019, the Parliament declared a climate and nature emergency. Just months after, we became the first industrialized nation to enshrine a decarbonisation target into law. So, you know, of course, it's difficult to attribute direct causality, but it's quite widely recognised the role that Extinction Rebellion had in stimulating this change across, you know, across public concern, media, and political action. This is something some colleagues and I wrote about at the time in Nature Communications, saying, you know, there's this huge upwelling in public concern for the environment, and yet it's entirely focused on climate change. We need to put, you know, we really need to put biodiversity at the heart of these conversations. So, I went to the first those big Extinction Rebellion protests in April 2019, and I chatted to lots of people, and I met, yeah, I met people from all sorts of sectors. I met students and retired people and doctors and lawyers and artists, and I didn't meet any scientists, and I didn't meet any conservationists. No one that was professionally concerned with conserving the natural world, and I thought that was really odd. Yeah, as scientists and as conservationists, we have, you know, we have a particular close-up view. We know what's happening. We have a particular understanding of just how severe this threat is, and yet where are we? Why aren't scientists attending such things? So I went home and I contacted the one other conservationist that I had heard was there, who was an ecologist then at Cambridge called Claire Wordley, and we set about writing this essay that was published in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, making the case that as scientists we have exhausted the acceptable channels to try to have an influence. And yeah, we've tried. It's not that we haven't tried, but it's not working. So since we're running out of time, maybe we need to do more. And it went on to cause quite a storm online. I think there were a lot of scientists that were waiting for something like this to be said. There's this metric called altmetric, which measures online activity around a paper, and for a while it was in the top couple of thousand most discussed papers online. So since they started measuring, so there was clearly a need for someone to say something like this. Since then, I've spent a lot of time thinking about why it is that academics have a particular obligation, I'd say, to support and to take part in these social movements that are calling for the changes that the evidence we provided just wasn't sufficient to bring about. The first is that it works. If what we're interested in is having a positive impact, and if we are, the evidence-based practitioners that we profess to be, then we need to look at the evidence, and the evidence suggests that social movements are, and specifically nonviolent actions, are effective in bringing about the changes we need. I personally feel I have a moral obligation. It's a moral obligation I've felt ever since the first time I came along to one of these things. I think partially it's partially it's covered by that idea that it's effective. Yeah, I feel a moral obligation to do what I can for other life on Earth, and this is what works, so I do. But also I feel a moral obligation to be there, standing shoulder to shoulder, I guess, with others that have come out in defense of life on Earth. People, when I first saw Exile, I felt very strongly that people are stepping out in defense of life on Earth, in defense of other species, in part out of love, but in part also because of what scientists have told them, because they have taken what the scientific community has said to heart. So I feel obliged to stand in support with them. And increasingly we see lots of arguments that doing so is morally justifiable as a scientist, as a citizen. As scientists, I think we have particular obligation, particular responsibility to act, because we are not simply citizens. We are scientists, and scientists have particular legitimacy. We are polls constantly show that we are one of the most respected sectors of society, and that means people are prepared to listen to what we say. We have greater reach. People are, rightly or wrongly, people will be more prepared to listen to someone that has the letters DR in front of their name than someone that doesn't. So if we do have this reach, then we have an obligation to use it, I think. But also because we are seen as respectable members of society, our actions help bring legitimacy to the wider movement. We often hear in the media and from governments too that these social movements, these people, these activists they're not like you. These aren't respectable people. They're unemployed, or they smoke weed, or they're hippies, or whatever. You shouldn't listen to them. They're not like you. Well, when we have scientists and lawyers and doctors and others taking part in these movements, not simply as citizens, but in their professional personas, that lends a credibility and legitimacy that can be really important. So all these arguments have been summarized in a recent paper that was published in Nature Climate Change by a bunch of colleagues last year, a bunch of members of Scientists for XR group. But for me, I think the most compelling reason, and the reason why ultimately I take part in such actions, is that it's a planetary emergency, and scientists have made very, very clear that we face a planetary emergency. 15,000 scientists have signed this paper, a World Scientist Declaration of Climate Emergency. And saying that it's an emergency carries a very strong implication. We don't call it a climate crisis or a problem, because the word emergency doesn't just describe the problem, it implies a response. In an emergency, we take urgent action. We stop what we're doing to address the task at hand. So if, as individuals that say it's an emergency, if as representatives of the scientific community that's saying it's an emergency, then we don't act like it's an emergency ourselves, then why should anyone believe? And this has been illustrated really, really compellingly, I think, in a well-known experiment, a psychology experiment from the 60s, known as the smoky room experiment. The psychologists asked participants to come and attend a meeting. And while they were waiting, they kept them there in a waiting room, filling out a questionnaire. And then they started to pump the room full of smoke. They pumped smoke under the doors. When the participants were alone, almost all of them got up very, very quickly, within 2 minutes, to go and find someone to warn them about the smoke, to tell them something's going on, you need to act. When they repeated the experiment with a room full of actors who were asked to excuse me, the actors were asked to visibly notice the smoke, but then just carry on calmly filling out their questionnaire. In that situation, the study participants would sit there for up to 20 minutes whilst the room filled with smoke. They noticed the smoke, their senses tingled, and they thought, right, something's going on here. But they looked around them and they saw that nobody else was concerned. So they think, right, well, maybe these people know something I don't. Maybe I must be overreacting. Yeah, I don't want to get up and make a fool out of myself in front of all these people when clearly it must not be something to worry about, because if it was something to be worried about, then all these other people would have done something. So this is the situation that we find ourselves in as a society today. Everybody's heard the warnings about climate change. Everybody's heard that if we don't change our agricultural practices, then there will be no more pollinators, and there will be big food security issues, soon. Everybody's heard that if we don't change our diets, then the Amazon rainforest, that's going to be gone. And yet we look around us and everybody's just continuing as normal. So we think, well, I don't know, maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I'm completely overreacting. Surely it can't be as serious as all that, because people will be out on the streets. Someone will be trying to do something about this. Surely, wouldn't they? And I think so. If as scientists, in particular, as as the people that all our friends think of us as, ooh, they're the green one, they're the environmentalists that I know, they're my pet environmentalists that I know. If even we aren't acting as if it's an emergency in every aspect of our lives, then why on earth would anyone believe us when we say that actually this is the most important thing there is and everything needs to change as soon as we possibly can? So that's why activism by academics is particularly powerful, and why activism by conservationists is particularly powerful. And it has a long history. It's not like this is a new thing. So, Carl Sagan was arrested in the 80s protesting nuclear weapons. This gentleman in the center here is the most famous climate scientist there is. It's James Hansen. It was James Hansen of NASA who gave his testimony to Congress in 1988 or 1989 and brought climate change to global attention. He's been arrested multiple times protesting tar sands. So scientific activism has a long history, but most of us still don't engage in it. We think this is not something for us. So why is this the case? What is holding us back? Well, the argument that we commonly hear is that scientists should be detached, neutral observers. Our role is to generate information, and we have to be completely objective as we do so. So if we were to argue for particular policy prescriptions, if we were to advocate a position or other, then we'd no longer be neutral. We wouldn't be objective, and we wouldn't be credible purveyors of information. And we hear this all the time. Well, actually, the idea comes from the Middle Ages. There's a historian of science at Cambridge called Amanda Power who's looked into this, and it comes from a time when scientific knowledge or academic knowledge was generated by monks. It was monasteries that were the seats of learning, but this knowledge was it came directly from God. It was the word of God, and in order to receive the word of God, the scholars had to be pure, empty vessels, completely detached from the material world. And ever since then, there's been this norm of neutrality. But of course, we're not in the Middle Ages anymore. We're in a planetary emergency, and norms can and must change. But the other thing I think is particularly odd about this is that I'm a conservationist, and conservation has never been a value-free science at all. It's not neutral. Conservation sees biodiversity as good, and it tries to conserve it. Conservation is trying to achieve particular political objectives, which is the maintenance of functioning ecosystems and the prevention of extinctions. It's explicitly political. We've never been detached, we've never been neutral, and we've never been value-free. And that's just conservation. I think this applies to all sorts of fields as well: medicine, public health, international development, education, sustainability science, urban planning, landscape planning, agriculture. All these things are trying to achieve certain objectives. They are this idea that we should be detached and neutral is just absolutely nonsense. So as a conservationist, as an environmentalist, you are inherently an advocate, inherently. And of course, the shift from advocacy to activism isn't a change in neutrality at all. It's merely a change in tactics. So the other argument we hear is that it will damage our credibility, that either the policymakers or the public will lose their respect for us if we engage in active advocacy or activism as scientists. Well, again, there's very little research here. And again, the existing research is focused on climate change, not biodiversity conservation. But the public not only overwhelmingly support engagement in advocacy by climate scientists, they expect more of it. They would like climate scientists to be more politically engaged. So it doesn't seem to this criticism that we need to stay out of the political arena because it will hurt our credibility. It doesn't seem to hold water when we look at the evidence. The reality, I think, is somewhat different, and this is based on some work that Aaron Cheery and some colleagues and I recently published just a couple of months ago, where we say that essentially, as most academics exist in a state of double reality, in that we intellectually recognize the existence of a crisis, but we don't feel a compulsion to act within it ourselves, or an obligation. Part of it is sort of what they call implicatory denialism. So we acknowledge the crisis, but deny the implications for us. And I think many of us do that through using these excuses that we heard in the last two slides. It will diminish my credibility, or things like that. I'm already, as a scientist, as a researcher, as somebody working in the NGO sector, I'm already doing something that's very important. Therefore, I can't do anything that might jeopardize my ability to achieve the change, the transformative change we need, using this insider track that I have as a professional, as a researcher, or whatever. And the other mechanism is disavowal, which is slightly different. It's different to denialism. It's basically it's simply not considering these issues within the realm of the things you talk about. It's a bit like the proverbial ostrich burying its head in the sand. It's you simply do not consider these issues within your day-to-day spheres, realms of consideration. But because we don't talk about or take action to bring about the transformative change we need, because as individuals we just passively carry on in our day-to-day lives as professionals, that passivity spreads between individuals through social contagion. If nobody's doing anything about it, so just not doing anything is the norm. But that leads to a weird situation called pluralistic ignorance, whereby because nobody's talking about it, because nobody's taking any action, we think that nobody else cares. And experiments have shown in the USA that people are overwhelmingly very supportive of radical policy change on climate change, but they also think that other people aren't very supportive of such changes. So everybody thinks they're more supportive of strong climate action than everybody else. So we end up in a situation where people think that only a small minority of people want these changes, whereas the reality is that a large majority of people want these changes. But because nobody ever talks about it, we think we're a minority. We make the case in our paper that even if you don't care about the future of the planet or the species or whatever, even if all you care about is being an academic, such passivity is completely maladaptive, because if we don't get the transformative change we need, then societies will collapse. There will be no universities, there will be no research on a dead planet. So just allowing everything to continue as it is blatantly maladaptive. It makes no sense. So we ask, why are academics so maladaptive? And it's a number of reasons. We do benefit from the status quo. It is difficult to, there are costs involved in trying to shake things up in the world you live in. People are wary of the individuals that try to bring about change. And of course, in the academic sector is hyper competitive, and particularly so in the modern neoliberalized university. So that everybody's already working 1.5 jobs already. Everybody's already running just to stay in one spot. And those that rise to the top, those that become established professors and get the lucrative grants and end up publishing the big high impact papers, those are the ones that are, it's a self-selecting cohort. It's only the people that say no to everything else and concentrate only on the things that are going to get them a grant or going to get them a paper that rise to the top. And so it's this, there are really strong selective pressures to not get involved in other things that aren't going to get you a grant or paper, even though doing so, even though stepping beyond our comfort zones as professionals is required from all of us if we're to help catalyze the social change that we need to bring about. Because ultimately, there's none of it. There are no universities, there's no research, there's no professorships, and there's no conservation projects, there's no conservation funding, and there's no conservation NGOs on a planet that has neither functioning ecosystems nor functioning society. So, sorry, I realize I'm speaking quite slowly, and this I should have wrapped up in an hour. It's taken an hour already, so I apologize. Much of the rest of this talk is, it's focused on academics specifically, but it applies to everyone throughout the conservation sector, I think. I just want to briefly talk about this paper where we talked about how many academics feel barriers to getting involved because they feel that they will face social stigma, and also they face these competing time pressures that we just talked about. So we argued, Aaron and Julia Steinberg and we argued that universities should explicitly incorporate activism and advocacy work into the work mandates of their staff. If universities want to have the so beneficial social impacts that they all say in their mission statements that they want to have, then we must recognize and reward staff for doing such work. And this was the paper that we published that in. So there are two main groups that bring together academics into acts of civil disobedience. The first that everyone on this call is a member of, I believe, is Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. And we're part of the Extinction Rebellion movement, and we're based in the UK, where Extinction Rebellion was founded. We take part in actions against a range of different targets, including museums and cultural institutions that accept sponsorships from fossil fuel companies, including media organizations protesting against the the silence on these issues. We have carried out actions against government departments in protest at the UK government's energy strategy. Here, scientists have glued themselves onto the Department for Business, Energy and Industry. Often this has resulted in us getting some really good media coverage. That last action was covered on the cover of 4G newspapers, and we get lots of online coverage. Mostly our actions have been focused on the need to bring about the end of the fossil fuel era, but recently we've also, partially because of the so-called attack on nature carried out by the UK government over the last couple of years, we focused increasingly on resisting this attack on nature. We'll also take action with a group called Scientist Rebellion. This is not part of the Extinction Rebellion movement, but a sister group that was formed in 2020 in the UK. Scientist Rebellion is now much more global in focus, with a much weaker presence in the UK. So 2 years ago this week, we carried out our largest action at the time, our first major action. We blocked a bridge in Glasgow where COP26 was being held. We blocked a bridge with chains around our necks, and 21 of us were arrested, of which 19 scientists. And at the time, this was the first mass arrest of scientists anywhere, we believe, for this nature and climate emergency, and it got a lot of exposure as a result. We were covered in the largest science journal, Nature. We were covered in the Sun and got called boffins, which is obviously a career highlight for any scientist. And we did this because scientists taking action visibly in lab coats sends a powerful message. It is not something you see every day, scientists getting arrested, and it's difficult to see scientists putting themselves in such positions without asking oneself why this is the case and why they would be willing to do so. April last year, the Scientist Rebellion carried out a global Scientist Rebellion that involved actions, over 1,000 scientists taking actions in 23 countries. I think there were 7 sub-Saharan African countries and 6 countries in Latin America. So this is a really a global movement. This article in Nature is from yesterday, I believe, 5th December, about the range of scientist rebellion actions taking place globally right now, as COP28 climate conference is taking part in the UAE. So check out that article. Not all activism is arrests. When we see sort of social movements on the news, generally they manage to get on the news by carrying out arrests, actions that leads to arrest, and this is the most obvious way to break through this media silence. But of course, it's not the only way to generate interest, particularly to generate interest locally. So this picture on the left is Extinction Rebellion's dirty scrubbers taking part in a protest at Barclays Bank. They dress up as cleaning ladies, and while of course you can get arrested, and indeed some of the individuals in that picture have been arrested for breaking the windows at Europe's dirtiest bank, you can't get arrested for cleaning the windows at Europe's dirtiest bank, and yet you can still make a significant point and generate significant local media coverage. This other picture is of a flash mob carried out by the group Mothers Rise Up outside Lloyd's of London, the insurers. They were trying to ask Lloyd's of London not to insure the Adani Carmichael coal mine in Australia, and just recently, I believe, Lloyd's of London did pull out from insuring that coal mine. So yeah, it works. It was effective, and obviously nobody was arrested in the course of that dance. The other thing is, of course, if all you see of these social movements on the news is seeing people be arrested, it's easy to think that's the only thing, the only role you can play. Whereas, of course, that is just the tip of the iceberg. And for every person in Extinction Rebellion that has volunteered to go to London and block a road and get arrested, there are many individuals, perhaps dozens in other roles who aren't risking arrest. And I think there's lots we can do as scientists, as conservationists, both from the position of outsiders, if you don't want to join, or as members of these groups. I think scientists have a particularly important role to play in providing expert witness statements for those that are in court, making it clear why they were taking action. If people are getting arrested in defense of biodiversity, then juries and judges that are involved in prosecuting them need to be hearing why those actions are important, why preventing biodiversity loss is important, and that's something we can do as scientists and as conservation professionals. Similarly, just lending vocal support in the media, on social media, on radio phone-ins, in the conversation at work around the kettle, during your break times. If there's this media backlash against activists that has become quite widespread in this country, and lots of people have perhaps lost sight of why we do what we do, and they are becoming increasingly unpopular. Well, even if you're not able to, even if you don't feel like becoming a member of these organizations, you're certainly able to defend them publicly, express vocal support, and I think that that's hugely important. As scientists, and as conservationists, we have skills that we can safely contribute in ways that do not involve necessarily going out onto the streets. Our research skills, our skills with writing and speaking and analyzing information can be put to good use in all sorts of different ways. So really, whatever it is that we enjoy doing, there is a role for us in the climate movement where we can put our skills to good use, and we will be welcomed into that movement. I just want to end with a quote from the world's most senior diplomat, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, who in April last year said this by now very famous quote about climate activists, saying how they're not radical. Well, I think he could equally have been talking about nature activists. There's nothing radical about wanting to conserve the beauty and diversity of life on Earth. There's nothing radical about wanting to conserve the conditions in which we thrive. What's radical is those insisting that we should sit idly by whilst nature is destroyed. So thank you very much. Thanks for your patience. Sorry, that was slightly longer than I had planned. There's all the papers that I mentioned, some of my essays and research relevant to this topic.